Hello, this is Mr. Blake, and this is the one of the videos in my series to help you get through reteaching and retesting on the Pre-AP World Geography Human Geography unit. This particular section is going to be on voting patterns in American elections. And so hopefully some of this information will be useful to you to be able to do better on the retest for this section if you are scheduled to retake this section. The big thing to know about American elections and American voting patterns is that we can make some general assumptions about how specific groups of people will tend to vote in the modern era, let's say 21st century America. And we can look at that by kind of breaking down the United States by regions and by types of people. So, one of the big divisions between our two political parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, is what groups will support or tend to support one or the other of the political parties. When you look at the American public, there's a big divide between urban dwellers, people that live in the cities, versus people that live in agricultural regions or very less dense populated areas. The city dwellers tend to support the Democratic Party. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. They tend to be a little more focused on things like public transportation systems, housing situations. Urban folks that live in the cities tend to be a little more ethnically diverse. They're not particularly one group or another, and that tends to lend people to seemingly lean towards the Democratic Party on that issue as well. They tend to be a little more educated because city dwellers have to do those kind of city dwelling jobs. And so there tends to be a slightly higher level of education. And all of that means that the cities tend to favor Democrats, whereas the rural areas, which tend to be small town America, tend to be less ethnically diverse. They tend to focus on issues that are often addressed more by the Republican Party, economic policy on trade, for instance, because many of them are focused on farm country. And a lot of our exports as the United States tends to be food. And so they're very, very interested in international trade. They also tend to be much more socially conservative than the cities. And this has a lot to do with the social role that churches often plays in these kinds of communities. So when we talk about the Bible Belt, for instance, that's a very socially conservative part of the country, owing to the presence of very socially conservative churches. And so the southern states of the United States, say Texas on back to the Carolinas, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, places like this, tend to be favoring Republicans because of that social conservatism. You see the same sort of thing in the Corn Belt, the Great Plains region. If you look at the Dakotas and Nebraska, places like Kansas and Oklahoma, tend to be relatively strong Republican states because, again, there is this link not only to an agricultural society, but also small town America, which tends to favor Republicans, as well as socially conservative, which also tends to favor Republicans. If you look at the west coast of the United States, California, Oregon, Washington, these tend to be much more democratically controlled states. Reason being is again, they tend to be very ethnically diverse, and most of the populations are in cities. So again, that urbanization, mixed population of different ethnicities, in this case, a lot of folks who happen to be of Asian background, a lot of African Americans, a lot of Hispanics will also tend to support the Democratic Party, which then gets into another group that we need to kind of look at, which is how do we identify ourselves ethnically? Will play often a role in how we tend to vote. If you consider yourself a white person, you tend to lean towards the Republican Party. or at least historically, that seems to be the case in the 21st century. But if you identify yourself as a minority ethnicity, let's say Hispanic, let's say Asian, let's say African American, you tend to associate yourself with the Democratic Party. Again, this probably goes more back to policies that one of the other parties support that brings on that support. But you can see it in states. You can see it in California, where the big cities tend to go overwhelmingly Democratic, but the agricultural regions of California tend to vote Republican. You see the same thing in Texas. The big cities tend to vote Democratic. The areas that have very large populations of Latinos or Hispanics tend to vote for Democrats, while the more rural areas, which tend to be much more Anglo or white, tend to vote Republican. So think about that and think about who lives in what region, and that might give you some insight, not only for this retest, but for November 3rd, when you're going to be watching all these elections take place, that you'll maybe be able to call some of the states before we have results, because you'll know something about those states and how they historically have voted over time. Another one of the things to think about there is think about the big megalopolis of the East Coast, the Northeast Coast, up where New York and Boston and Washington and Hartford and Baltimore and places like that. That is a very urbanized area. And so when you're looking at New England in states like Pennsylvania and New York, New Jersey, they tend to vote Democratic. Same thing with the Great Lakes states. By and large, most of the people that live there live in cities. So if you look at Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, places like that, they tend to vote, again, Democratic. So keep those in mind. Another thing that you might want to think about is gerrymandering. We talked about it in this unit, and it is a very particular American thing to do. Gerrymandering involves the idea that when you redraw political boundaries, because every 10 years we have a census, and because based on the census numbers, every congressional district should be about the same size in population, they have to redraw the boundaries because populations change over time. And so whenever we go through the process of redrawing political boundaries, you run into the process sometimes known as gerrymandering, which is that you draw those political boundaries based on whether or not it gives your particular political party an edge in that district, or it's harming your opponent's political party by carving them up in such a way that they don't get representation. And the way it works is like this. Let's assume that we have a state in which voters are about 50-50. I could take a map of that state, 50-50 voters, and draw the boundaries in such a way that my opponent's political party, maybe I'll try to cram them all into as few districts as possible. So they will have overwhelming numbers. There's no way my political party will ever win those districts. But if I can cram them all in as few as possible, maybe we have 10 districts. Maybe they'll only win 3, and then the rest of them who don't have really any of their voters in those districts, that means we're going to win all the rest. So they'll get 3, we get 7, even though the voters are about 50-50. And you do that by trying to figure out, okay, where are the support of those opposing voters? Let's try to cram them in. And that's the reason why you often see those weird kind of spidery looking districts that kind of sprawl all over the place. That's probably what somebody is trying to do, is cram a particular type of voter into that one district to take them off the map, if you will, so they won't influence any of these other districts. The other way that you can do it is you try to make districts that there's opposition voters in it, but there's never enough for them to actually win any elections. So think about creating districts where maybe 60% are your guys and 40% are the other guys. 60-40 they can vote all they want, and they're probably going to lose most of those elections. So you set like maybe one district or two aside where they're going to have vast majorities, but you've managed to kind of dilute their voters in all the other districts to where they don't stand a chance to win. So in that case, maybe I'll win 8 districts and they'll win 2, something like that. But anyway, it's manipulating the maps to favor one political party or another, and it creates weird things like really weird congressional-looking districts that are all shaped like spiders or bats or crabs or whatever you want to think that they look like. They're very odd-looking usually. The last thing that I need you to make sure that you know is what's the Electoral College and what does it do. I don't think that a lot of folks figured this part out, so I'm going to make sure that you got that. The Electoral College is something found in the U.S. Constitution, the document that kind of sets the framework for our country. And it is a particular institution in which the states will send delegates or electors to the Electoral College, and it is this group of people who actually cast votes to determine who's going to be the president of the United States. Now, I know on November 3rd, everybody is very, very, very psyched up to go and cast a vote for one political party or another, or one candidate or another. But the truth of the matter is that in the presidential race, it's the Electoral College that actually elects the president. So how does that happen, and why do we care as voters if we're not directly electing the president? Well, this is how it works. Each of those electors, every state has a set of electors based on their congressional delegation, the number of people that are in their members of the House of Representatives and their 2 senators. So you have different states with different populations, and so different numbers of electoral electors. Now, in most cases, the state, if one candidate or another wins the majority of the votes in that state, then they're going to send electors that are going to be supporting that particular candidate or that political party, all of them. It's called winner take all, and that means that if I win 50% plus 1 vote, then I get every electoral vote from that state. Okay. Now, some states have very few, like Montana, which only has 3. They have 2 senators and a member of the House. Or you have something like California, which has 55. They have 2 senators and a whole bunch of members of the congressional delegation. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't Republican voters in California, but it's a winner-take-all thing. So if a Democratic candidate wins California, they win all those delegates as well. There's a couple of weird ones. Maine and Nebraska divide their electors up by congressional districts. So sometimes you'll see that the electors from those 2 states could be from 2 different political parties. And that's just because they look at the individual congressional districts and who won each one of those congressional districts. Most times it's the same guy, but sometimes there is a difference between the congressional districts, and it's possible that the candidate that won the majority of the state still doesn't win all of the districts. And so that's kind of how the Electoral College works. It's actually the body that determines who gets to be the next president, which is why everybody gets very excited on November 3rd to see which way different states go, because they know that if they win this particular state, Ohio or Florida or Georgia or whatever, that they're going to get those electoral votes. So tune in on November 3rd. It's going to be exciting. I do hope that this information will help you get through the retesting as well. I hope you do well on the test, and I hope to see you soon.